In 1908, a beam rolled off a mill in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and changed the shape of every American city. It was an H-shaped piece of structural steel, wider, lighter, and stronger than anything that had come before it. And within 20 years, it would hold up 80% of the skyscrapers in New York. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, Madison Square Garden, all of them stood on steel that was forged in a town of 70,000 people on the Lehigh River, 50 miles north of Philadelphia. The man who bet his company on that beam, Charles Schwab, had been told by every accountant and engineer he employed that the gamble would bankrupt him. The mill cost triple what anyone estimated, but by 1909, it was the company's biggest moneymaker, and Bethlehem Steel held a monopoly on the structural beam that built modern America. That monopoly lasted into the late 1920s, and the town that made the beam, the town named for the birthplace of Christ, founded by German missionaries who believed all people deserved equal education and equal care, that town became, for a time, the most important manufacturing address in the Western Hemisphere. But this story starts 2 centuries earlier, and it starts in snow. On December 21st, 1740, the shortest day of the year, a man named David Nitchman stood in leg-deep drifts along the Monocacy Creek and began cutting down white oak trees. He was 64 years old. He had been born in Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, and he had spent time in a dungeon there for his Protestant beliefs before escaping in 1725. Now he was in the wilderness of eastern Pennsylvania, at the point where the Monocacy empties into the Lehigh River, and he was building the first house of a settlement that did not yet have a name. The Moravians were members of the oldest organized Protestant denomination in the world, the Unitas Fratrum, tracing their roots to the Czech reformer Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake in 1415 for insisting that ordinary people had the right to read the Bible in their own language. 3 centuries of intermittent persecution had not extinguished the movement. By the 1720s, a German nobleman named Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf had offered his estate in Saxony as a refuge, and from there, the Moravians launched an extraordinary global missionary campaign to the Caribbean, to Africa, to the indigenous peoples of North America. Pennsylvania was their American base. They purchased 500 acres at the confluence of the Monocacy and the Lehigh from William Allen of Philadelphia. The price was negotiated through agents in April of 1741, and by early that year, Nitchman and 12 other settlers had raised a log cabin, 40 feet by 20, with a peaked gable and a roof that projected far out over the walls. That cabin was the first house of Bethlehem. It stood on what is now Rubel's Alley, behind the site of what would become the Eagle Hotel, and it was not torn down until 1823. The name came on Christmas Eve. Zinzendorf himself had arrived from Europe that autumn. On the evening of December 24, 1741, while the settlers gathered in the log cabin for their evening worship, Zinzendorf looked around at the farm animals that shared the space and listened to the settlers sing a hymn, not Jerusalem, but lowly Bethlehem, and declared that the settlement would be called Bethlehem. It was a name given in a barn in winter by candlelight. You could not have invented a more fitting origin. What Zinzendorf and the Moravians built in the years that followed was unlike anything else in colonial America. Bethlehem was a planned community, run as a general economy, a communal system in which no one drew wages. The church provided food, clothing, and housing. Residents worked for the glory of God and the support of Moravian missions worldwide. They lived in same-sex communal houses organized by age and marital status, what they called choirs. Single men lived together. Single women lived together. Married couples had their own quarters. Children were raised communally. And everyone, men and women, Europeans and Native Americans, even African Americans, received the same education and the same medical care. This was radical stuff in the 1740s, and it worked. By 1747, just 6 years after the first tree was felled, Bethlehem had 36 different trades and industries operating within the community, exporting goods throughout the colonies. There were blacksmiths, potters, carpenters, weavers, tanners, and millers. The Moravians built a waterworks in 1762, a system that pumped water from the Monocacy Creek through board logs to a central cistern, one of the first municipal water systems in North America. They built a tannery in 1761. They ran a grist mill. They had their own ship, the Irene, built in New York in 1748, which carried immigrants from Europe for 10 years before it was captured by a French privateer off Cape Breton in 1758. Between 1743 and 1769, nearly 600 Moravian immigrants arrived in Bethlehem on vessels like the Irene, every one of them a church member, everyone absorbed into the communal economy. They opened the Moravian bookshop in 1745, originally called the Bethlehem Booker Shop. It sold devotional texts, hymnals, stationery, and general supplies. It is still operating today on Main Street, the oldest continuously operating bookstore in America, and possibly the world. They founded a girls' school in 1742, which makes Moravian University, its descendant, the sixth oldest college in the nation, and they built the Gemeinhaus, the community house, in 1741, a white oak log structure 94 feet long and 32 feet wide, with a chapel, dormitories, and a two-story attic. It is believed to be the largest 18th century log structure in continuous use in the United States. It still stands. The Gemeinhaus was the heart of Bethlehem in those early decades, but the building that mattered most to the outside world was the Sun Inn, built in 1758. The Moravians were strict about who could live in their community. Until the 1850s, only church members could lease land in Bethlehem, but they were gracious hosts. The Sun Inn was built specifically for non-Moravian visitors who had business with the settlement, and the guest list became astonishing. George Washington slept there. So did Samuel Adams. So did the Marquis de Lafayette. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army used Bethlehem's buildings as hospitals. More than 500 soldiers died there, and the town's reputation for cleanliness, order, and good cooking spread up and down the eastern seaboard. Benjamin Franklin visited and marveled at what he saw. He wrote in his autobiography that the Moravians worked for a common stock, ate at common tables, and slept in common dormitories, great numbers together. Benjamin Rush, the physician and signer of the Declaration of Independence, visited in 1789 and noted the gentleness of the inhabitants' manners and the fact that children as young as 5 and 6 were taught habits of early industry. Bethlehem, in its first century, was a place that made visitors feel they had glimpsed something better than the ordinary run of colonial life, a place where community actually worked. But the general economy could not last forever. The influx of outsiders that came with the Revolutionary War changed the town's character. By the early 1800s, Bethlehem was loosening its restrictions, becoming less a Moravian commune and more a conventional American settlement. The Central Moravian Church, the largest church building in Pennsylvania when it was completed in 1806, marked the transition. It was a grand statement of permanence, but also an acknowledgement that the old communal ways were giving way to something new. When Bethlehem was incorporated as a free borough in 1845, it opened land ownership to non-Moravians for the first time. The little theocratic experiment on the Lehigh was over. The population was modest, a few thousand souls, but the institutional foundations the Moravians had laid were extraordinary for a settlement of its size. A university that is today among the oldest in the nation. A bookstore that has not closed its doors in 280 years. A waterworks, a tannery, a grist mill, a tradition of music so strong that Bach's greatest choral work would receive its American premiere in the town's church. And underneath all of it, a culture of craftsmanship and practical industry. 36 trades running simultaneously in a community of a few hundred people. That would make the transition to the industrial age feel almost natural. What replaced the Moravian commune would be something nobody in that candlelit barn on Christmas Eve 1741 could have imagined, but it would grow out of the same soil. The iron came first. In 1857, a Moravian merchant named Augustus Wola organized the Saucona Iron Company on the south side of the Lehigh River. The timing was terrible. The Panic of 1857 halted the company almost immediately, but the idea was sound. The Lehigh Valley had everything iron needed. Coal from the mountains to the north, limestone from the hills, water from the river, and a railroad to carry the product out. That railroad, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, was the creation of Asa Packer, a Connecticut-born carpenter who had come to Pennsylvania and worked his way up through canal boats to become a railroad magnate and congressman. Packer had hired Robert H. Sayre as his chief engineer, and it was Sayre who saw that the railroad would need a local source of iron for its rails. Walla's company was reorganized, moved to South Bethlehem, and renamed the Bethlehem Iron Company. A man named John Fritz was brought in from the Cambria Iron Works in Johnstown to build the blast furnaces and rolling mills. Fritz arrived on July 5, 1860, stepping off a train in Bethlehem with his wife and young daughter. He was 37 years old and had already invented the three-high rail mill, a revolutionary system for producing strong, durable rails. His salary was $5,000 a year and 40 shares of company stock. The timing, once again, was terrible. The Civil War began 10 months later, but Fritz got to work. Construction of the first blast furnace began on July 1st, 1861, and it was operational by January 4th, 1863. The first railroad rails rolled off the mill on September 26th of that year. What Fritz built on the south bank of the Lehigh was the embryo of Bethlehem Steel, and it would grow into something colossal. But notice the geography. North Bethlehem was Moravian. Old stone buildings, church spires, the quiet hum of a community rooted in faith and education. South Bethlehem was industrial. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, the clang of iron, the glow of molten metal at night. The Lehigh River ran between them. Two towns, two worlds, separated by water. The borough of South Bethlehem was formally created in 1865, the same year that Asa Packer, now one of the richest men in America, donated $500,000 and 57 acres of land on South Mountain to found Lehigh University. That $500,000 gift was, at the time, the largest donation ever made to an educational institution in the United States. Packer wanted a school that would train engineers for the industrial age, and he put it right above the ironworks, on the hill overlooking the furnaces. Lehigh's early graduates would go on to run Bethlehem Steel, and eventually it could be said that most of the iron, steel, and coal in America was produced under the direction of Lehigh University men. South Bethlehem became, almost overnight, a different country from the Moravian north side. The ironworks needed labor, and labor came from everywhere. By the 1880s and 1890s, Irish, Slovak, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and Polish immigrants were pouring into the narrow streets south of the river. They built their churches, Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, on every other block. They opened butcher shops and bakeries and saloons. The street names stayed English, but the languages spoken on them were anything but. A man could walk 3 blocks on a Saturday evening and hear 5 different tongues. The houses were row houses, built tight against each other, and from the front porches you could see the furnaces glowing down by the river. The air smelled of sulfur and hot metal. Laundry hanging on the lines came off the clothespin with a fine dusting of soot. But the pay was steady, the work was plentiful, and the families who came built something. Parishes, mutual aid societies, fraternal lodges, social clubs, that gave the South Side a texture and a warmth that lasted generations. Bethlehem Iron's first decades were respectable but unspectacular. The company made rails and competed, often poorly, with bigger operations like Carnegie's Pittsburgh complex. John Fritz knew that rails alone would not sustain the business, and in the 1880s, he got his chance to diversify. Congress decided to modernize the U.S. Navy, and a competition broke out among steel companies to win contracts for armor plate and heavy guns for battleships. Bethlehem won. Fritz led a massive expansion of the plant. New machine shops, munitions depots, additional blast furnaces across the company's 1,000-acre campus. And by the early 1890s, Bethlehem Iron was the biggest defense contractor in the United States. The gamble, backed by directors Robert Sayer and Joseph Wharton, ensured the company's survival when other Lehigh Valley iron makers, dependent on merchant pig iron, were shutting down one by one. In 1899, the company was reorganized as the Bethlehem Steel Company. Joseph Wharton put it up for sale in 1901, and the majority of shares were acquired by Charles M. Schwab, who had been Andrew Carnegie's protege and the first president of United States Steel. Schwab had left U.S. Steel over disagreements about how to run the company, and he saw in Bethlehem something that the cautious men in Pittsburgh did not, an opportunity to take a smaller, more agile company and make it dominant. He incorporated Bethlehem Steel Corporation in December 1904, with himself as president and chairman, bringing along the steel plant in South Bethlehem, iron ore mines in Cuba, and shipbuilding concerns in California and Delaware. His total annual ingot capacity was less than 1% of the national total. Within 35 years, he would build it into the second largest steel producer in the world. Schwab hired an electrical engineer named Eugene Grace, a Lehigh University graduate who had started at the plant as a crane operator, and the two men became the partnership that drove everything. Schwab was the visionary, the risk-taker, the man who schmoozed with presidents and financiers. Grace was the operator, the organizer, the man who could squeeze production out of a plant the way a farmer squeezes milk from a cow. Together, they would build something extraordinary. But first, they had to bet the company. Schwab's first great gamble was the Gray Mill. Henry Gray was a London-born steelman who had spent years working in American mills and had patented a process for rolling wide-flange structural beams, H-shaped in cross-section, stronger and lighter than the built-up columns and riveted I-beams that builders had been using. Schwab had tried to convince U.S. Steel to produce Gray's beams while he was still there. They had refused. The accountant said the mill would be too expensive, the market too uncertain. Now, with his own company, Schwab decided to build it anyway. The decision was announced in December 1905. Then the panic of 1907 hit. Credit froze. Schwab retreated to a New York hotel with his secretary, James Ward, and spent a day and a night thinking it over. Early Sunday morning, the phone in Ward's room rang. "Get up, Wardy," Schwab said. "We are going back to Bethlehem and talk to the boys." He had decided to push forward. The Gray Mill was completed in January 1908. It had cost $12 million, triple the original estimate, and Schwab still needed another $1.5 million in working capital just to get started. His old friend Andrew Carnegie, now retired, came down to inspect the new mill and was so impressed that he loaned Schwab some of his U.S. Steel bonds as collateral to finance bank loans. Even Carnegie, who had seen everything the steel business had to offer, recognized that the Gray Mill was something new. But Schwab still needed buyers. One potential customer after another backed away. Architects and builders were conservative, suspicious of any product that hadn't been tested for decades. Finally, with some persuasion from his investment banker Pliny Fisk, the builders of Gimbel's department store in New York agreed to use 12,000 tons of gray beams in their new building. The architect, Ernest R. Graham, talked up the beams among his colleagues. By August 1909, the Gray Mill's products were the company's biggest moneymakers, and the mill operated at full capacity for the next decade. Other steelmakers fumed on the sidelines, but they could do little. Bethlehem held a monopoly on the wide flange beam that lasted nearly 2 decades. Henry Gray himself, now retired to the suburb of East Orange, New Jersey, paid tribute to Schwab as a master hustler of steel, and said that without his courage, the new structural shapes would have lain dormant for many years. Those beams changed the skyline of every major American city. Before the Gray Mill, building tall meant riveting together smaller pieces of steel into columns, expensive, slow, and limiting. The Bethlehem beam could be rolled in a single piece and customized by adjusting the rolls. It was stronger per pound, cheaper to install, and it made skyscrapers not just possible, but economical. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, Madison Square Garden, all of them went up on Bethlehem Steel. As the company's chief engineer, Carson Defenderfer, once said, Bethlehem was king in Manhattan. And then came the wars. World War I proved to be enormously profitable for Bethlehem Steel. The company supplied the Allies with artillery and took a $135 million order from Britain, the largest in the company's history to that point. The plant became the largest ordnance and munitions supplier to the Allied powers. In 1916, Eugene Grace took over as president from Schwab, who stayed on as chairman, and the company went on an acquisition spree, snapping up the American Iron and Steel Manufacturing Company, Pennsylvania Steel, and Maryland Steel. After the war, it absorbed Lackawanna Steel, Midvale Steel, and Cambria Steel. By the late 1920s, Bethlehem's steelmaking capacity had reached 8.5 million tons, and the company employed more than 60,000 people. The prosperity was real, but the seeds of trouble were already visible if you knew where to look. Bethlehem's executive bonus program was, even by the standards of the Roaring Twenties, breathtaking. In 1929, Eugene Grace received a bonus in excess of $1.6 million, roughly 3.3% of the company's entire earnings. The policy attracted a stockholder lawsuit in 1930, demanding that $36 million in bonuses paid since 1911 be returned. No money came back, but the settlement forced publication of executive bonuses in annual reports, and the numbers gave organized labor ammunition for decades. The culture at the top of Bethlehem Steel was insular, hierarchical, and increasingly nepotistic. The company built a world-class country club for its executives. The Saucon Valley Country Club opened in 1921, where corporate decisions were made on the golf course as often as in the boardroom. There was a rigid system of executive privileges: who parked where, who ate in which dining room, who got an office on which floor. The men who ran Bethlehem Steel lived like minor royalty in a company town, and they saw no reason to change. But in Bethlehem itself, the money was building something remarkable. Charles Schwab drove the decision to replace the aging Eagle Hotel on Main Street with a brand new structure. The Bethlehem Hotel Corporation was formed. Shares were sold to community members at $50 apiece. $1 million in stock was raised, and Schwab himself contributed additional funding. The land was purchased from the Myers estate for $75,000, and construction began in March 1921. When the Hotel Bethlehem opened in 1922, it was, by some accounts, the largest hotel in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia. 200 rooms, a grand ballroom, formal dining rooms, a barbershop, a cigar shop selling Damasco Coronas, and a clubroom that served as the social headquarters of the Lehigh Valley. The guest list was extraordinary. Amelia Earhart arrived in 1928. She had flown herself down from Rochester, New York, in 3 hours to attend a banquet in her honor. Winston Churchill stayed in 1929 while visiting the steel plant. He and Schwab had been friends since Churchill's days as First Lord of the Admiralty. The hotel was the place where civic and corporate life intersected, where steel executives entertained customers, where visiting dignitaries were lodged, where every important wedding reception and charity gala in Bethlehem took place. It sat on Main Street, directly on the site where the Moravian settlers had built their first log cabin in 1741, and the lobby had the kind of quiet grandeur that American hotels used to have: high ceilings, heavy drapes, polished wood, the murmur of conversation, and the clink of good china. On December 7, 1937, in the depths of the Great Depression, hundreds of citizens gathered at the Hotel Bethlehem for a ceremony that gave the city a second identity. Marion Brown Grace, the wife of Bethlehem Steel President Eugene Grace, led a celebration in which Bethlehem officially adopted the nickname Christmas City, USA. Thousands more listened on the radio as the Bach choir sang the old German hymn, Jesu ruf mich, and the city embraced the connection between its name and the holiday that had always been central to its Moravian heritage. From that year forward, a steel star, eventually 81 feet tall, was erected on South Mountain each December, visible for miles, shining over the blast furnaces on the south side and the stone churches on the north. The Star of Bethlehem, made of steel, lit by electricity, presiding over a city that manufactured the beams that held up the modern world. It was as close to a perfect symbol as any American city ever produced. The Second World War pushed Bethlehem Steel to its absolute limits. Eugene Grace shifted all capacity to war production and reportedly pushed output to 101% of normal capacity. The company became the second largest supplier of steel to the U.S. military, producing over 73 million tons during the war. Its 15 shipyards turned out 1,121 ships, more than any other builder, including destroyers, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and cargo ships. At the Maryland plant alone, the yards were launching more than one ship per day. At peak production, Bethlehem Steel employed nearly 300,000 people, 180,000 of them in shipbuilding. In the plant along the Lehigh and South Bethlehem, the workforce topped 31,000, including thousands of women who took up welding torches and crane controls for the first time. The company ranked 7th among all U.S. corporations in the value of wartime production contracts. Historians cite Bethlehem Steel's speed in manufacturing warships and military equipment as a decisive factor in the Allied victory. The company supplied steel for armor plate, heavy guns, shells, aircraft engines, and the forgings that held tanks together. If U.S. Steel was the body of America's wartime industrial effort, Bethlehem Steel was its right arm. This was the high water mark, not just of the company, but of a certain idea of what an American industrial city could be. Picture Bethlehem in, say, 1952. The population is around 66,000 and growing. Main Street is lined with shops. The Moravian bookshop, the department stores, the lunch counters, the jewelers, the five and dime. The Hotel Bethlehem is the social center, its tap room decorated with murals by the military artist George Gray, depicting scenes from the city's history, its dining rooms busy at lunch with steel executives and Lehigh professors and visiting customers from New York. After Prohibition ended, the tap room became the place in Bethlehem. Dark wood, good whiskey, and the quiet confidence of men who knew that the product they made held up the buildings in every city their customers came from. Lehigh University's campus climbs the hill above the steel plant, its limestone buildings looking down on the smokestacks the way a head looks down at its own body. The blast furnaces glow at night, and if you stand on the hill-to-hill bridge and look south, the sky above the plant pulses orange, a second sunset that never quite sets. Men walk to work in the morning and walk home in the evening, their lunch pails clinking against their legs. The churches are full on Sunday. Central Moravian on the north side, the Catholic parishes on the south, the Episcopal Church that Asa Packer had endowed. The Bach Choir performs every spring. It had given the American debut of Bach's Mass in B minor in the Central Moravian Church on March 27, 1900. And by the 1950s, the festival drew music lovers from across the country. The star goes up on South Mountain every December, and 100,000 visitors come to the Christmas city between Thanksgiving and New Year's. The steel plant employs entire families, fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and the wages buy houses, cars, educations, retirements. A steel worker in the 1950s could own a home, raise a family, send his children to college, and retire with a pension. The math worked, the taxes flowed, the city hummed. And Arthur B. Homer, president of Bethlehem Steel in 1958, is the highest-paid business executive in the United States. The year that matters is 1959. The United Steelworkers of America went on strike in July of that year. 116 days, the longest steel strike in American history, halting over 85% of U.S. production. The big customers came back when it was over, but the small ones didn't. Belgian barbed wire was landing on the docks in Baltimore at less than it cost Bethlehem to make it. Steel imports jumped from 2 million tons in 1958 to 5 million tons in 1959. They never returned to the 1958 level. The strike had forced buyers to look overseas. And once they looked, they found that German and Japanese steelmakers, rebuilt from rubble with modern equipment after the war, while Bethlehem was still running plants designed in the 1920s, could produce steel more efficiently and sell it for less. Nobody in Bethlehem's executive suite seemed to notice, or if they noticed, they didn't act. The company continued to expand capacity. In the 1960s, it built its largest plant at Burns Harbor, Indiana. In 1967, it lost the contract to supply steel for the World Trade Center, 50,000 tons in a single contract, to competitors in Seattle, St. Louis, New York, and Illinois. The loss was a signal, but signals mean nothing to men who believe the gold will mine itself forever. Don Swan, a former member of the legal staff who later became a vice president at Jones and Laughlin, remembered the mood at headquarters during the good years with a certain wryness. Bethlehem's hallways were lined with gold, he said, and when you became employed, they gave you a pick to mine it. The problem was that nobody had taught the next generation of managers what to do when the gold ran out. The corporate culture, insular, hierarchical, closed off, had rewarded loyalty and conformity for decades. The gung-ho management that had built the company never educated its successors on how to manage in times of distress. And the labor contracts, negotiated during the years of plenty, had a clause, Clause 2B, stipulating that prevailing work rules could only be changed when new processes were installed. In practice, this locked the plants into their existing methods. To modernize the technology, you first had to change the work rules. To change the work rules, you first had to modernize the technology. The circle was vicious, and nobody broke it. September 30th, 1977, was Black Friday in Bethlehem. The company laid off 10,000 employees in a single day. By 1982, Bethlehem Steel posted a loss of $1.5 billion. In 1983, for the first time, more people were collecting pensions from the company than paychecks. The union contracts negotiated during the good years, the work rules that specified who could do which jobs, the clause that said prevailing rules could only change when new processes were installed, had effectively locked the plants into the past. Management had been too comfortable to modernize, labor had been too strong to give ground, and the foreign steel kept coming. The closures came one by one, each with its own arithmetic. The Johnstown plants, founded in 1852, shut in 1992. Coal mining operations were discontinued in 1991. Shipbuilding ended in 1997. And on November 18, 1995, the last steel poured at the Bethlehem plant itself, ending 132 years of continuous production on the south bank of the Lehigh River. The blast furnaces went cold. Martin Tower, the company's 21-story corporate headquarters, had been built in 1972, a sleek, cruciform office building on the west side of town, the tallest structure in the Lehigh Valley. It was almost new when the decline began. Within 15 years of its opening, it was almost empty. It cycled through a few tenants, then went vacant. For years it stood there, a dark monolith against the sky, and Bethlehem residents would look at it and think, somewhere in that building, in an office, is where everything went wrong. In May 2019, Martin Tower was imploded. 53 acres of land, cleared in 16 seconds. On October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel Corporation filed for bankruptcy, the 25th American steelmaker to do so in 4 years. 13,000 employees remained on the payroll. 95,000 retirees were collecting pensions. In 2003, the company was dissolved, its remaining assets sold to the International Steel Group, which was later absorbed by Mittal Steel, which merged with Arcelor to become ArcelorMittal. The name Bethlehem Steel passed out of American corporate life. What happened to the ground where the steel was made is, in its way, as improbable as anything in the city's history. In 2004, an investor group purchased the 120-acre historic core of the steel plant along the Lehigh River. That same year, Pennsylvania legalized casino gambling, and in 2006, the state awarded a license to the Las Vegas Sands Corporation to build a casino on the eastern end of the old steel site. The deal was contentious. The community was split roughly 50-50, but the city's mayor, John Callahan, framed it as a way to fund historical preservation and community projects, and approval rose to roughly 2/3. As part of the arrangement, the Sands donated 10 acres to ArtsQuest, a local arts nonprofit, and PBS 39, the Lehigh Valley's public television station, for a new arts and cultural campus. The 5 blast furnaces, 20 stories tall, stretching a quarter-mile from end to end, were left standing. They were not demolished. They were not carted away. They were preserved as backdrop. In 2011, the Steel Stacks campus opened at the base of those furnaces. It includes the ArtsQuest Center, an outdoor concert pavilion, a visitor center in the restored stockhouse, and the Hoover Mason Trestle, an elevated walkway built along the old industrial rail line that once delivered raw materials to the furnaces. At night, the stacks are lit up, rusted iron against colored light, the ghosts of industry turned into public art. More than 1.5 million visitors come every year. Music Fest, the largest free outdoor music festival in the country, fills the campus for 10 days each August. Nearly $250 million in combined economic and social investment has flowed into the site. The Hotel Bethlehem is still open. It has been voted the #1 historic hotel in the United States by USA Today 5 consecutive years running. Its restaurant is called 1741 on the Terrace, a nod to the year the Moravians built their first cabin on that very spot. The Moravian bookshop is still selling books across the street, 280 years after Samuel Powell first stocked its shelves. In 2024, the Moravian church settlements in Bethlehem were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the newest in the United States. Main Street was voted the best main street in America. The population of Bethlehem today is about 78,000. larger, actually, than it was during the steel era. But the composition is different, the economy is different, the sound is different. The clang of the rolling mill is gone. The three-shift whistle is gone. The men walking to work in the morning are gone. What remains are the stone buildings the Moravians laid in the 1740s, the Gemeinhaus with its white oak timbers, the church where the Bach choir still sings, and those 5 blast furnaces on the south bank of the Lehigh, standing in a row like enormous sentinels, rusting quietly in the open air. The star still goes up on South Mountain every December, 81 feet of steel and light visible for miles. It shines over a city that was named in a barn, built by missionaries, forged by iron men, and lifted to greatness on a beam that nobody but Charles Schwab believed would work. Below the star, the furnaces are dark. They have been dark for 30 years, but they are still standing. And if you walk the Hoover Mason trestle at dusk, you can reach out and almost touch the rusted iron, the same metal that held up the Empire State Building, the same metal that built 1,000 warships, the same metal that made a small city on the Lehigh River for one extraordinary century indispensable to the construction of the modern world. The star shines, the furnaces are silent, the Monocacy still flows into the Lehigh, the way it did when David Nitschmann stood in the snow and swung his axe at the first white oak on the shortest day of the year in 1740.